Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. This is 2022 UNE Constitutional Day. And the Constitutional Day idea, which is a very annual event for us, is started in 2004. Started by a senator who passed away. His name is Jim Byrd from West Virginia, who noticed that most young Americans, they don't know the Constitution of the United States. And he came in the Congress with the idea that there has to be a Constitution Day related to the ratification of the Constitution in September 17th. That event became an annual event to educate and raise awareness about the U.S. Constitution. And he advocated that idea and linked it to any institution in the United States that receives funds from the federal government are required to organize such event so students could talk, discuss, and there will be various ways of exploring and raising awareness about our Constitution in general. Most of my colleagues really not very crazy about this event. They say this is required, so they make roll their eyes and they really make fun of the requirement. I don't. I have been taking the leadership and coordination for this event at UNE and try to make it creative. It doesn't have to be boring, nor it has to be really top-down. So we take it at UNE to be something very creative and very interesting and very relevant to whatever our students and our community at UNE would like to explore. So every year we change the format, a panel by students, faculty, or a speaker from among our own faculty, like today as Constitution Day, or sometimes we invite somebody from outside. And we try very hard to make it a more interesting and more worthy of our time, especially it's during lunch time. And UNE used to offer lunch, but it looks like we are now, we think that lunch is no longer being offered here. It's not my fault. If it was my choice, we'll offer you some lunch here. But anyway, so this is really the broader idea behind organizing the annual Constitution Day around the 17th or 16th of September every year. Today's speaker is a colleague of mine. I remember I hired him earlier, 2007, when he was aspiring young graduate students at that time. And he wandered around the globe as far as New Zealand and India and another country called California as well, and came back to Maine. So he has been pursuing travels and exploring, but also he went to graduate school in New Zealand. And he had a degree there, master's degree from Canterbury University in New Zealand. And he finished a PhD in New York City at the City University of New York, the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. And his work is really at the intersection of literature and political philosophy, I would say, with the focus on justice and representation of justice in general. And I thought since Courtney is work is on the representation of justice, it's really a good idea to share his own thinking and try to link it to our Constitution Day. We both are teach political science, but we are in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at UNE. So this is really the the larger background, and Ken is going to present to us for maybe 30 minutes his take on the question of how the Constitution protects and fails to protect people, which is at the heart of our debate today in our society about the Supreme Court, the Constitution, the very, very heated debate about Roe versus Wade and the justices, and whether the Supreme Court of the United States is really becoming more politicized than before or not. Our society is very, very immersed, and as every generation tries to debate new issues and a new interpretation of the Constitution and public life in the United States. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Ken Courtney. So Ken, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Ali. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. I'm honored to be here to give today's talk, and I'm humbled by anyone showing up to listen to it. So I appreciate you coming. There are so many caveats and qualifications that I want to give, but I'm told I have a bad habit, and so I won't give any of them. I've already thanked you for coming. I'm going to do my best just to talk. I'm going to try not to look down here very much at all until I want to direct quote something or I lose where I was headed. So, as Ali mentions, my most sort of developed work and most developed thinking within the political and social space has to do with questions of representation. And of course, the Constitution, like any political constitution, is deeply involved with questions of representation. So I thought the first thing I should do is say something about what representation means to me. That way, at least we're starting on the same page. This first part will be a tiny bit theoretical, philosophical, because it's me. But I want you to sort of share in how I'm thinking about representation before I ask the sort of deeper question. And the deeper question for me is fairly simple. Of the many, many things we could ask about the Constitution today, I'm sort of framing how the Constitution protects or fails to protect people in terms of how does it represent people's interests or fail to represent their interests. So to get a handle on that, we have to say something about representation. Representation for me is special. So I'm using the idea of representation in an almost sort of technical sense. There's a long story here, but I won't bore you with it. Here's what I think we all should agree to, or at least for the purposes of this conversation, you'll know how I'm using the word, right? I think of representation as having this special set of qualities to it. It's more than just being in a place and at a time with a particular title. It's having a particular set of capacities, usually having been placed in whatever representative role you happen to be in by a certain set of procedures. This is sort of canonical. And I add to this, I'm not the first author to have said this, but I sort of emphasize, you can't just sort of occupy the desk and have gotten there through the right procedures and maybe have the capacities in your pocket, but not actually be engaged in the action of representing other people. So let me give you a couple deliberately absurdist, but I think illustrative sort of background cases of what representation does not look like, right? Just to help ground us a little bit. Some of you have seen films, some of them were made by Sacha Baron Cohen and others, where a person is kidnapped. They're dressed up, they're put behind a pulpit or thrown into an office, and the whole game is he's not the legitimate leader. Why not? Well, for all those reasons. We don't think that he probably has the capacity to represent anyone that he's supposed to be representing. Never mind that he's a dictator in the film that we're talking about. He probably doesn't have the capacities. He certainly didn't go through anything like a democratic or other set of procedures that put him there. And perhaps most importantly, there's no reason to expect that this person is going to engage, authentically, genuinely, in actually representing the people who are under his power or under his influence, under his government. Okay. Couple more special ingredients. Again, just by way of illustration. Suppose that the New York Philharmonic Society has a representative, how convenient here today, and at the end of the talk they think, that was a nice talk. Would you like to come and play first chair violin at the New York Philharmonic? To me, right? Me being me, I say, of course. And they say, great, the deal's done. A bunch of people are going to be terribly disappointed on opening night performance at the Philharmonic, right? What has happened? I have been given a title and a position without the adequate capacities or indeed any of the training that I would need to fulfill the role. And what I'm getting at here is something like a concept that I think of analogous to representative. In this case, it's musician. I can pick up a guitar and try and like strum a chord. I won't find any because I'm not a musician at all. I'm sad to report. I wish I were, right? This means that I think we all share the view the concept of musician contains within it the idea of a certain level of proficiency. It's not just anyone that is a musician because, I'm kind of interested in music. They have a certain level of capacity. Note, this leaves open the possibility, indeed, the well-understood range of not that great mediocre musicians and really, really stellar musicians, but we still think that there's a bottom threshold there somewhere. We use the word athlete in the English language in a similar way. So a student comes to my office to talk over a paper, and they see me bouncing a tennis ball on the wall while I read a book. They are not going to conclude from that he's a great athlete, right? They would be wrong if they did. What they're going to conclude is this is a nervous habit or something else. For the very same reason, we think that athleticism or being an athlete contains some minimal threshold of capacity. And again, it's not just capacity. It's not just that I could do it. And it's not just that the New York Philharmonic officially named me to the role of first chair violin. So I actually play music, right? Or actually engage in athletic sporting activities that make it reasonable to say that person's an athlete. Okay. This is my sort of analogous way of thinking about what representation means in a political sphere. So they have some capacities. They're put there in a purposive, intentional way for good reason. And they're actually carrying out some practices that we tend to recognize as they're engaged in representing the interests of people. Okay. So let me say first, I think that representation is tied tightly to the interests of the individuals that they are involved with. I hope that's already somewhat clear. What I want to do first is, well, two things. I want to give a series of cases where I think the Constitution of the United States serves this function well. That is, the Constitution of the United States, at the very least, creates conditions, very intentionally structured to create conditions where the interests of citizens can be represented well, thoroughly. It's going to make that low threshold and then some, right? So the degree to which it is representative in that specific sense. And then I'm going to give you only one negative case, but it's a big one, right, of why I think there are areas in which the Constitution fails to protect people in this sense, doesn't adequately advocate for their interests. Okay? Pausing. Good. So 3 positive cases. And again, pardon me one moment. These are deliberately sort of schematic accounts. So I'm going to talk about the separation of powers. I'm going to talk about the emoluments clauses. I'm going to talk about freedom to religion, but in a relatively fast and loose way, not like a constitutional law scholar, because I am not one, okay? But I think we're all on the same page. We can talk in the Q&A if people like about, different interpretive models and textual meaning and things like this, but I think we can get enough out of this to be on a sort of same page understanding. So let's talk first about the freedom of religion. It's probably the most familiar, or alongside freedom of speech and assembly, the most popularly understood of all. Right, it has an establishment clause and an exercise clause. The establishment clause famously says, the The government of the United States is not going to enshrine any particular religion as the religion of state. There is no official state religion in the United States of America. If you haven't paused to think how breathtaking that is given the era in which the Constitution was drafted, you should. It's pretty breathtaking. It's an incredibly meaningful, powerful thing. To give this contemporary valence, right? When a judge, as has happened a number of times in the last couple of decades, decides that they want a framed copy of the Ten Commandments on the wall of their courthouse, many have reasonably judged this is unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional because it suggests that the legal practices of this country are informed by a particular religious tradition. They can't be according to the Establishment Clause, right? The Exercise Clause, of course, fills this out by saying people are free to practice their own religion in their own way, as long as they're not interfering with the welfare of other citizens, and so forth. Again, we all have an intuitive understanding of what this means, but you can contemporize it, again, very easily by thinking of recent cases where, for example, an entire community, within an entire community, the Muslim population alone is surveilled. Right? All of their mobile phone records are pulled, all of their emails are tapped, but no one else in the community is. This is discriminatory practice. It's judged by many to be unconstitutional because it is, after all, discriminating on the basis of religion who's getting surveilled by their government, right? So those are two sort of contemporary cases looking back at one of the oldest and best understood cases. Again, my suggestion to you is, not only does the Constitution at least provide the tools, let me choose my words carefully, at least provide the tools for the establishment and free practice of religion, it does so with very, very high marks. There's a side here which is very, very important. This is not to say that in practice the aspirations of the Constitution are always well realized. It's saying that the Constitution was incredibly thoughtfully prepared to prepare for exactly these kinds of problems. That's the foresight that I'm crediting some of the authors with, for recognizing somebody's going to try and put the Ten Commandments on their wall. And according to a fairly mainstream constitutional interpretation, this shouldn't be allowed. Second positive case. Let's go with emoluments. Actually, no, let me back up. I want to save emoluments for last. You'll see why. Pardon me. Let's talk about the separation of powers. Again, I think most of us have a general sense. Your high school government class reminded you that there are controls upon the executive. It shouldn't have a certain kind of overreach, and therefore Congress has its due sort of scope, as does the judicial, and we want some kind of meaningful balance struck between these. A couple sort of details, just so we all remember, the President of the United States isn't even mentioned in Article 1. The President gets mentioned in Article 2 well after the Article 1 establishment of Congress, because as intended by the framers, Congress carries the weight, right? Congress, and this was their thinking, who is closer to the people than the President of the United States, will have the power to legislate. They have the power of the purse, that is, they control the money. Congress can declare war, not the President of the United States, and so on, yeah? So these sort of general checks are, again, canonical, but important to remember. I'm gonna give you a specific contemporary case like I did again, and in this particular one, I'm gonna ask you to ignore the names involved. You can't, I can't either. But try to see the sort of structural and dynamic questions involved as opposed to the names of the people, okay? When Mike Pence refused Donald Trump's injunction to reconsider the Electoral College count and to push the count, as he said, back to the states or find other electors in some other way, Mike Pence refused. There are a number of reasons why Mike Pence might have refused, and I certainly don't know what they are, but there are probably at least two, and one that is deeply constitutionally relevant. That is on the basis of legal counsel, no doubt. Mike Pence knew, as vice president, his duties at the counting of the electoral votes is purely administrative. He's got a ministerial role there There is no constitutional authority whatsoever for the vice president to tamper with, eliminate, recount, or anything else. The votes have been cast by this point. This is important, and again, I want to suggest to you that our founders, the authors of the Constitution, had a lot of foresight in actually understanding that tyranny was as likely, if not more likely, to arise from within than from right foreign attack or foreign incursion. As an aside, Mike Pence also would have known by this time that there were 61 state and federal court cases evaluating whether any corruption or fraud or voter tampering had happened in any of these contentious states, and 61 of 61 courts, both Republican-dominated and Democratic-dominated, said no, zero, no evidence whatsoever. So he was on firm evidential ground as well. Finally, number 3 on the positive side, the word emolument was totally unknown as far as I'm concerned until about 10 years ago. No one had ever heard of this. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly to make sure we get to, that I hit my time mark and we have plenty of time to talk. But the emoluments essentially say the following. There's a foreign and a domestic version of the emoluments clause. Both of them essentially say, we want our president to be independent. And what that means in this context is, we don't want someone to come into the highest office in the land who is beholden to outside financial interests, be they domestic or international, right? Take the obvious case. If ExxonMobil, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and whoever else it is finances an entire campaign for a presidential candidate, reasonable thinking citizens will be justified in worrying that the interests of these corporations, as opposed to the interests of everyday citizens, are going to inform the thinking of the president and the decisions he makes, the favors he extends, and so forth. And by the way, the same is true if a campaign is financed by Greenpeace and a bunch of other, right, on both sides, it's true, right? Whatever your political leanings might be. Too much money in politics was thought of as problematic from the very beginning. Right now, as many of you know, there's a furor going on about insider stock trading among both houses of Congress, right? Both the Republicans and the Democrats. They have insider information. That is, they know when a stock is likely to collapse or to jump based on their high-level confidential meetings they have, and they have been acting on this. It's a furor, and it should be. At least in the spirit of the emoluments clause, it's very close to the same concerns about conflict of interest. The founders knew this, they were deeply worried about it, and therefore they made ironclad rules disallowing it. I have to transition to the ways in which our Constitution fails to protect people. So I'm going to continue that last note in the following way. In 2010, the case that many came to know as Citizens United passed in the Supreme Court, right? And again, there's a lot of technical things, technical components, but essentially Citizens United said, for the purposes of campaign finance, we grant that corporations have the status of persons. That means it's unlawful to place any limitations on how much money they can contribute to campaigns. To disastrous results, many thought. So this baffled a lot of people, including Justice Stevens, who wrote for the minority, and I want to quote his dissenting opinion here. Quote, "The court's opinion is thus a rejection of the common sense of the American people, who have recognized a need to prevent corporations from undermining self-government since the founding, and who have fought against the distinctive corrupting potential of corporate electioneering since the days of Theodore Roosevelt. It is a strange time to repudiate that common sense. While American democracy is imperfect, few outside the majority of this court would have thought that its flaws include a dearth of corporate money in politics." So there we go. This brings us to how the Constitution fails to protect people. As with many other aspects, sections of this talk, There is far too much to say and far too little time to say it, and I don't want to exhaust my listeners. Oscar Wilde said that was the worst thing you could possibly do. So I'm going to focus on one very particular thing, but it's wide-ranging, and I hope you see its sort of significance. The way in which I think that the Constitution, in its most relevant sense, fails to protect people goes back to the deepest question of all, which is, from the beginning, the Constitution has struggled with who receives its protections, who is it intended to represent, and how do we get clear about that? So I'm going to take us all the way back and try to move quickly forward. And I hope, again, you'll see the relevance. In 1619, the horrors of slavery came to the shores of Virginia. The condition and subhuman treatment of those people did not begin to change substantively for the following 250 years. But, and this is less known and more interesting, once the Republic was up and running, they were paid special attention to for certain purposes, particularly census counts, and particularly census counts as informed the Electoral College. Here's your civics lesson, really quick reminder. Electoral College apportionment for states is the very same as your House of Representatives membership plus your 2 senators, okay? I come from the state of Wyoming a very long time ago. Nobody lives there. So we get 1 House rep, right? We've got 1 member of the House of Representatives. And like every other state, we have 2 senators, right? So that's 3 Electoral College votes all day, right? What happened in the early days of the Republic was that heavily slave-owning southern states recognized the advantage that they would have if they counted the enslaved African peoples in their apportionment, while of course there being no question of them being allowed to vote or receive the full protections of the Constitution. 5 first presidents of the United States weren't just slave owners, but Virginia slave owners, right? 4 of the first 5, all from Virginia. Okay. To get what I think is a sort of critical understanding, we have to go a little bit forward in time and sort of broaden out our topic, our discussion of history, to land, peoples, and conquest. And I'm going to try to move a little quickly. I have no idea how much time I have used. How much time do I have left approximately?
Well, you have maybe 5 to 10 minutes
Okay.
maximum.
Okay.
Try to be as wise as you can.
It would take longer than that. Okay, good. So moving forward in time, the Spanish-American War of 1898, in my mind, is a dramatic break and an important inflection moment in U.S. history, particularly with respect to representation. Let me explain why. In very short form, the so-called Spanish-American War, the actual battles between the United States and Spain lasted a very short amount of time. The places in which the war took place involved very protracted engagements with the United States and subject populations. So in conditions of a deflating Spanish empire, the United States first forced the Spanish out of Cuba and then annexed it and stayed around and did the same in the Philippines, Puerto Rico, we already said Cuba, Guam, Samoa, Hawaii, and a few other islands in the South Pacific. A startlingly important question arose. In these U.S. territories, what is the status of the people currently under the power of the United States government? To put that question more sharply, at this time, is the United States of America a democratic republic, or is it an empire? To clarify, democratic republics offer the protections of power to the people over whom power is exercised, and they also allow some influence, usually through voting, over the power for the same reasons. Empires, of course, have operated differently in different places at different times, but they feel no obligation either to offer protections to subjects or to provide any mechanisms for them to influence power, right? This is at the empire's pleasure. I have to tell you, you all know the answer to the question, which was sobering. And the reasons given for that decision were even more so. The answer given was no, right? No, neither will Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii, and so on be liberated and returned to their states of independence, but also no, they will not be put on track to be incorporated. That is, they won't begin the process to become states and then citizens and have a full recognition by the Constitution and so on. The United States of America effectively operates an empire over these territories, in some of these places for a few years, in others decades, and in others over half a century going forward. In the interest of time, I'll read just a little bit to make sure I cover what I wanted to say. Thus, the people of these territories joined at that particular time the fate of a number of other people who were subject to power without the protections offered by that power or any means to influence. They joined the African Americans in the United States of America, who at the turn of the century, as you all know, are by this time technically free from slavery, from the 13th Amendment, 1865, but as most of you know, are still suffering from slave-like conditions under Jim Crow, right? They also joined the fates of indigenous populations in this country. We're well past the Trail of Tears at this time, but the conditions looking for recognition and land rights for the indigenous people remains very much the same. And indeed, if less dramatically, they joined the ranks of women in this country who wouldn't be given the vote for another quarter century and whose rights had long been recognized as less important and less significant than those of males. That is, all of these groups, not just the offshore territories, but also African Americans, indigenous persons, and women in this country suffered the simultaneous fate of being subjects to power without the protections of that power and without means to influence it directly. Worse, as many theorists have said, and I can talk more about this, these deprivations went on long enough that they became naturalized. That is, people stopped seeing how grievous they were. It became kind of natural to think that this was the order of the universe for some people, making implicit biases common and making things much more difficult to change, right? Okay. Today, the status of Puerto Rico, to use one specific example, is a disenfranchised territory with legislative but not constitutional rights. That means two things. Puerto Ricans are disenfranchised because they don't vote for the President of the United States. They have a representative that goes to Congress but only has observational status, is not a voting member in the Congress. Yet Congress exercises authority over Puerto Rico, and their rights are legislative. What that means is a particularly activist Congress that got really angry about a bunch of protesting Puerto Ricans can actually take those rights away. They can curtail the right to free speech or other rights if they so choose. This is what it means to have legislative rights, but not constitutional rights. Constitutional protections cannot be taken away by Congress, right? At least not in a not without a very, very long, difficult path. So, the status of Puerto Rico as a disenfranchised territory with only legislative rights, the mass incarceration, ongoing disenfranchisement, and inhibited economic opportunities of African Americans, and the persistent income disparities and curtailed rights of women are usually thought of and talked about as entirely different phenomena and entirely different subjects. My suggestion is that they're not. They're instead part of this same historical legacy and confront the same question: who gets the protections of the Constitution? Whom does it represent? If the answer to this question continues to be some but not others, more trouble is coming, both in terms of allowing ongoing injustice, but also with regard to the stability of the Union, as I think everyone is aware. So, to conclude, I will end where I began. The Constitution does, of course, protect many, many people, and this point's important, in ways that are rarely duplicated either historically or geographically. So don't let the last thing I say carry all the weight because I said it last. Make no mistake. The people in this country are many of us in this country are incredibly lucky by the rights and protections that are enshrined in the Constitution and that it affords us. At critical moments, It represents the citizens of this country in soaring, paradigm-changing ways. It also stumbles, leaving many out of account or insufficiently represented. Viewed as a musician, makes the category, the Constitution is a virtuoso, capable of extraordinary musical performance, while at the same time still struggling with chopsticks, learning scales, and trying to find middle C. Our Constitution has great power and tremendous potential. It indeed creates conditions for the interests of many millions to be represented. Crucially, it contains resources for its own modification. It can be amended, and the founders recognized that building in mechanisms for change and amendment were crucial. It allowed, after all, Martin Luther King Jr. and many others who had mastered its internal logic to speak freely, to assemble, to mobilize, and to effect change, resulting in civil rights legislation and so on. It contains tools for greater equality and justice across many dimensions. Like any code or institution, however, the Constitution is only as good as the people who animate it, those who learn it, those who will demand more of it, and those who will defend it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ken. A very interesting presentation, and it highlights certain things that the Constitution as theoretical and legal document was very, very interesting, and it may protect some segment of the population along the history of the United States. And at the same time, you know, the question of representation seems to be, from what you shared with us, is really an ongoing process. Because in reality, and when it comes to power relations, you know, in a living society, that's going to be really another dimension to look at, where you have freedom of religion in the Constitution, and in God we trust, and we swear, our presidents swear on the Bible, yes, when they are presented. And our last president, when he gave a speech in Lafayette Park, he had the Bible almost upside down,
That's
I think.
Right.
Yes,
Right.
So we're not really unique in that sense in the United States. There is the ideal and the legal documents. That's very important. And there are ongoing fluid reality and power relations. And you also alluded in your presentation to the 1619 project, which is, I think, very significant. This is the first slave ship that allows us also to counter the Constitution and its promise, and we the people, and the idea of equality and representation of mankind, but also the reality of slavery. And how that really, you said in your presentation, in some ways, the Constitution allows citizens to be protected and have rights. But also, along that history, it failed, because in terms of power relations, Citizens United and other that also try to protect the powerful, the rich, and the mighty ones who could really exercise lobbying and make their voices bigger than others. And I think the allusion to civil rights movement and the women and the Puerto Rico ambiguous status and the question of empire are all important factors to be brought in when it comes to the question of representation to me. And I feel like part of the problem when we talk about representation, the debate being framed in either an idealistic way, and a lot of issues in terms of reality inside the United States and outside the United States in the territories are taken out. Are we really a democratic federal republic, or are we empire, or are we both? And there is tension when it comes to representation between the democratic egalitarian voices in American society and the one that try to make it a more of a elitist imperial country. And I think, to me, this is at the heart of the question of representation, power and representation,
Agreed.
legal constitutional arrangement, and real human beings trying to make sense of that constitution. That's very important to all of us and unified us as Americans. The last point, I think, in reacting to your presentation, I would say, I always claimed that what's unique about the United States is not that the Constitution was egalitarian. God knows it was not. Most people were excluded. But the struggle of social movements by women and men and different groups in society to make it egalitarian, that's probably why the Constitution is more representative in some way. And the failure that you alluded to and shared with us is really less and less. But every generation has to fight that fight, and your generation has to take the Constitution very seriously, for that matter. I'll stop. Just I thought maybe some comment about very thoughtful theme, which is at the heart of your research and work. Thank you very much. Now that the floor is open for questions and comments, and I'm going to try to be egalitarian, as I'm claiming here, to give enough, equal weight to the right side and the left side. And Sammy is going to carry the microphone and tell us who you are, so we know who you are, okay? Oh, that's Mike.
Student over here.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Ali. I'm Mike.
Okay.
Ken, really interesting talk. I really appreciated it.
Thank you.
One of the points I think you made, which I think was striking to me, is that we're currently in a world where corporations are people and Puerto Ricans aren't.
That's right.
Right? I mean, I think that's what you take away from your talk.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering some of the implications of that, both in how we got here and where we go from here, right? I mean, are these things in the Constitution? Are they the result of the separation of powers and the courts? How do we find ourselves in this situation, and where do we go?
Well, that's a great set of questions, I think. Let me take the sort of geographical integration piece first. To explain just a bit more fully, at the time when these questions were being argued over, should we integrate, that is, incorporate as states, Guam, the Philippines, Hawaii? By the way, yes to Hawaii, but only in 1951, right? So 53 years after these debates were initiated, and 10 years after Pearl Harbor. People forget. If you want to be controversial, and it's tempting to, say that the Empire of America was attacked by another empire on the day which went down in infamy, 1941, because Hawaii was not part of the United States at the time. But my point is that these issues were hotly debated. It wasn't by any means unanimous that we shouldn't integrate these individuals in the territories. The answer was simply to make them citizens, create states, or again, to liberate them and restore their independence. I think that without a deep dive into the historical sort of archives, and I don't have all of that knowledge, to be perfectly frank, the particular exigencies meant this one, not that one, and so yes, Hawaii, that gets incorporated, becomes a state, they gain citizenry, they vote. No Philippines, too far abroad, a whole bunch of other considerations. And then also borderline cases that are sort of left out of time, and I think of Puerto Rico as one of these cases. Some of you know Puerto Rican politics a little bit. There is a continual pushback, right? They would like to integrate. It's often argued that this would be the right thing to do. For what it's worth, my grandfather's second wife, Bati, was Puerto Rican and said that she would come to the United States only as an American citizen. She never made it, right? So I think those connections to history are very alive, and I don't know where that leaves us with respect to these territories and the challenging sort of politics of their status with respect to the mainland.
Puerto Rico is a very interesting case because Puerto Ricans are divided. Some are advocating for a statehood. Some, they want independence. And I think your grandfather's wife is really part of that kind of heritage in many ways. And I think we often forget about these islands and these territories because they are part of American history. And Hawaii became independent because of what Ken said, the attack on Pearl Harbor, but also Hawaii was dominated by white families that really became dominant economically in the long term. And that they also was pushing for statehood as well. So that complex history need to be recognized, I think, in many ways if we want to have a grasp who we are as Americans in our constitution, ever-changing constitution. Okay.
Can I just very quickly, second part of Mike's question, I'm gonna be much more concise.
Yeah.
The question of money in politics is, of course, massive. The emoluments clause can be read many different ways, right? From different vantage points, different styles of constitutional interpretation. There seems to have been slippage, and the sort of idea is that once Pandora's box was open and a little bit of funding found its way into campaigns, favors were being done, the very sorts of things that the emoluments clauses were intended to rule out, it was very difficult to say of previous cases that was unconstitutional because precedence takes over. So there's this strange sort of building effect of allowing different kinds of money to figure into politics in different ways. Mm-hmm. And then with the presidency, again, forget about the name, but with the presidency of Donald Trump, the floodgates were just fully opened because many scholars have said to run international businesses, domestic businesses, have foreign diplomats stay in your hotel where they paid bills, right? All of these things just blow the doors off of anything like an emoluments clause. So there is a sort of gradualism up to sort of explosion.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Lee.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really engaging, and I learned a lot out of it, which is so of the great flavors of all the offerings here at UNE. I had a quick question. When you were talking about representation, maybe you could talk a little bit about Washington, D.C. and sort of the loophole that they're in, not being a state and not getting represented, and what should we do with that knot? Untie it, leave it, or?
It's a great question. So I mentioned my home state of Wyoming having no people in it. So we have 3 electoral college votes. DC has 3 electoral college votes, in spite of the fact that there are millions of people there, right? This is hotly debated. The constitutional reasons for establishing it that way had to do with distancing influence from the procedures, as far as I understand it. As some of you know, there are now a number of movements suggesting grant DC statehood. Millions of people live there, they vote, and so forth. If they did, it would constitute a dramatic shift in the Electoral College, and not lost on anyone, probably significantly on the bluer or more democratic side of the political aisle. I have my own personal opinions, but they're relatively personal. My instinct, though, is I would like to hear the arguments against the consistency argument, because to me, from a political perspective, consistency sort of demands it, again, on the basis of representation, exactly as you suggest. It feels to me like DC residents aren't receiving fair representation at the Electoral College.
Yeah. Yes. Amy, yes.
I have a question, but I'd like to see the floor to students.
Okay.
So thank you, Ken. And Ellie, I'm Amy Kierstead. I'm the Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences, one of the Associate Deans. So Ken, I was so interested in learning about the impact of the marginalized groups and people that occupy territories. And my mind naturally went to another group of people, and not to compare this in any way, but permanent residents are people who immigrated to the U.S. by choice or by circumstance, are expected to be law-abiding, are impacted by the decisions of the government, pay taxes, contribute to the economy, have children that are U.S. citizens or, become part of a U.S. family but aren't citizens and can't vote. So I'm curious about your perspective of how the Constitution impacts U.S. permanent residents.
It's a great question, and I can tell you what I know pretty quickly because it's not that much. What I know is that, like so many of these policies, it has a historical legacy to it. It was initially based on the idea that people coming here from abroad are of unknown stock, and I use that word as it was, right?
I'm not
Yeah, exactly. We don't know about you, Amy. And so there was a section that I left out when I was talking about the Spanish-American War and the sort of grim decision made and the even grimmer basis for the decision. And that decision about choosing not to integrate any of these territories was just explicitly based on racial lines. All right, skin color was mentioned in all of these conversations, in the Congress, in high-level political meetings, over and over again, as well as the usual tropes that there are uncivilized peoples in those places, they're barbaric, and all of these unfortunate pejorative things that we're painfully familiar with, barbarians. And so I think that the permanent resident question is essentially a tag-along to that problem, because rather than creating this special case of this individual came here from away, we would indeed have to vet them to make sure that they were civilized, not barbaric, of the right sort of stock and so forth. No doubt there is more fine-grained understanding of it, but I believe that historical legacy has impacted the policy.
Yeah, and I think this is a very, very good question, because constitutions, a humane and representative constitution, have to deal with the question of residents, asylum seekers, refugees, people who are victims of a lot of atrocities. And it's a testimony to a society and a constitution where it has to deal with it. Unfortunately, this issue now being politicized in our society, and that kind of way of being kind and generous and extending it to non-citizens is being really, so ideologically loaded, including what happened recently with those refugees in Malta, vineyard. Then even a normal conversation is not possible, unfortunately. But this is a great theoretical also constitutional question. What are you going to do with the strangers, with the newcomers, with the refugees?
Right.
And that's also in Europe too. The European also, they are going crazy about that issue as well.
That's right. I was going to, in close conjunction with your question, Amy, the question of dreamers, the children of immigrants, they face a similar
And
sort
children,
of difficult set of
Yeah.
choices.
And children and the Constitution, what are they going to do with children? That's another great question. I want to hear from our students too.
Me too.
I'm going to force you. So ask questions, guys. Come on. I know you have some ideas. Yes, please. Tell us who you are.
Thank you. Okay, I'm Peyton. And this might be too broad of a question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway.
Sure.
What advice do you give to, college-age students to stay involved and motivated and up to date on politics and the Constitution, especially after current events, feeling like it's just such a discouraging topic nowadays?
Are we still recording?
Yeah.
Become a political science major.
That's what
There
I
it
thought.
is.
Yes. Or globalist.
That was the easiest question. Next.
Yes. And come see me.
No, it's an authentic question, and it's really important. Thank you for asking it. The first, I think, injunction for all of us is to educate ourselves. And that can be difficult for citizens. It can be difficult for students whose path of study doesn't necessarily brush up against these issues very frequently. But I think our first obligation is to educate ourselves so that not only you have to vote, not only you can vote in informed ways, but in these more subtle sort of ways, social conversations, when you participate in them, you understand what's at stake. You appreciate the sort of stakes of the conversation. Beyond that, of course, there are many ways of getting involved, not least of which is having a poli-sci minor, at least. But there are a number of clubs, groups, resources I can point you to, but I think the fundamental thing is we have to take, as citizens, we have to take seriously the sort of obligation to be educated enough to be fluent in the conversation around politics and what's happening.
Yeah, I think very well said. I would say not only your generation need to learn about the Constitution and about society, but also we are really part of the larger globe around us. And I think a good education requires students' interest and passion to ask hard questions and learn and ask and continue to push for this critical knowledge that you might need, whether you like it or not, you might need and now and beyond. And I think this is where an experience at UNE would be worthwhile if you become interested and ask questions in the classroom and outside the classroom. And if most of you are awakened and interested, then the rest will happen. The rest will happen because we need all of you to become more interested and more passionate about knowledge and ask hard questions of everybody. And I think that's the way to go.
If I could just have one sentence, interest adds up to engagement, right? So when half the population votes, this is not good. When 75% of the population votes, it at least signals to those in powers that we're paying attention. So when people start to educate themselves, they get engaged and they want to participate, and it's really important.
Very good. More student questions. Come on, guys. We're not going to leave this room unless they ask questions.
Lock the doors.
Come on. I know we have something in mind, and we'll be kind. We'll be kind to you. Just so you're for.
And you're not going to offend me or Ali.
Come on, Jack. Ask a question.
I have no idea. Oh, it's on.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, hi, I'm Jackson. I guess how, with the precedent that's been sent with the previous president, especially with his dealings with money and as well as corporations being seen as people, do you think that this is only going to spiral out of control from now forwards with the current president that's been sent by it, especially since it being occurred with an individual at the highest office? Or do you think people are going to try to rein it back? Or do you think it's already spiraled out of control?
Thank you, Jackson. Nice to see you. It's a really good question. It calls for speculation, which is my favorite kind of question. So I'll speculate along both lines, but I'm optimistic by nature. So I'm going to say that I think that enough people might have witnessed the dangers inherent in allowing a sort of free flow of money into the White House and the potential power problems of outside influence. Again, forget about the names. It happens to be this guy, Donald Trump. But money in politics is much larger than him, right? I think that the recent events that we have seen will have opened the eyes of enough people that perhaps there will be motive, right? There'll be motivation for people to, reenact the Dodd-Frank Act, right? Get some reasonable legislation about controlling money in politics and so forth on the books, and hopefully to build on it. One can imagine the netherworld scenario, which is politicians thinking, well, they're doing it too, and the only way to win is to have corporate financing.
And the resolution that Ken referred to, Jack, Citizen United, in my opinion, was disastrous.
Agreed.
Because it's really gave the corporations and big money and banks and politicians with a lot of resources to really corrupt our institutional and constitutional participation. And money manufacturers consent, as my students in Poli-Sci 105 will remember. And to me, I hope that's something that we could revisit and come back to it. But this is a real issue because it comes to the question of representation that Ken spoke about, when you have unequal resources, the role of participation become really impacted. And especially, we have a whole segment of our citizens, they don't vote. 40% in general, and sometimes only 20-25, they elect a president. So we really have a problem in reality.
If I may just add, tagging off of Ali's comment, there's a deeper issue which Jackson and many of you are well aware of, which is the levels of inequality in our society in general. It creates all sorts of distortions and difficulties with respect to representation. It, of course, creates distortions with who could even run for high office, absent some miraculous campaign funding them. And so there's this deeper, very difficult set of questions about the billionaires separated from the sort of day-to-day paycheck people and how they form a society together and how you represent that level of disparity and so on, which is very, very much of the moment, I think.
Yes, yes. I think that's the larger elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Is there citizens and equal access to power, and how to square that to have a freedom and at the same time protect the citizen to participate. That's the larger dilemma, where there will be maybe elect a mayor in Bedford or in Saco or where we live or so. But the higher we go, some scholars think, the more really it becomes complicated, and the unequal resources and money impact our choices. This is a dilemma in democratic society, definitely. Let's take another question. Yes, oh yes.
So I'm Jacqueline, and I'm really interested in there's always this thing that comes up in my mind whenever I think of the Constitution, is that the founding fathers said you can just throw it out, you know. And I always wondered, what scenario do you think we would be in to decide to make the decision to just scrap the Constitution? What might happen if we do that?
What a bold, wonderful question. The first thing that I think I should say is pragmatic, which is that it's extremely unlikely, because on both sides of the aisle, it has become a sort of article of faith. The sacred document and all of the rest of this stuff. Constitutionality, as you know, has been appealed to by judicial review, that is the Supreme Court deciding whether the exercise of power is legitimate or not under the eyes of the Constitution for 200 years, and so on. And so one of the things that human beings have a hard time with is admitting their mistakes. To throw out the Constitution would be to say most of this stuff wasn't legitimate, right? Judicial review, all of the sort of founding instructions and things don't really count or didn't get the job done. That's extremely difficult. I don't know what else to say other than it would require some radical upheaval. If that radical upheaval had to do with the survival of the state, there was suddenly an existential threat that the current governments, successive governments, seemed unable to meet. If half the continent was underwater because of climate change and the government still denied that climate change was real, perhaps some radical revision to our founding documents could be considered, but it would take something extraordinary.
I think Paul, who is, when I say something, we just wait until they give you the microphone, Paul.
What would probably happen is we would operate like the United Kingdom, which doesn't have a written constitution.
That's right.
Yeah.
So they operate through court decisions,
Yeah.
what the parliament does, and so they'd have to use that for litigation.
And if I
Thank
may
you.
add just a quick note to what Ken said, This is a good question, Jackie. But the answer to your question varied because there are some people try to look at our Constitution as the most sacred thing we have in America that unify us as Americans. And others would say, well, it was flawed. But also the struggle to, the fact there was flexibility to amend it and change it is really what's unique about the two last centuries, where the unrepresented became voice themselves, what I call the subaltern talk. The one who are spoken for, they began to speak themselves and demand, whether that women, non-properties, whites, the Afro-Americans, and the other groups, including now the Puerto Ricans, the Native Americans asking for a different kind of recognition. So you could see that as a positive one. There are also other people, other scholars and activists who say, for crying out loud, this is an 18th century document. It's time to really get rid of it and try to create a new constitution. So the debate is really wide and varied in many ways. The easiest one, as what Ken, I think I agree with him, is that you continue to amend it, including electoral college, that's so complex and undemocratic, some scholars will argue. And that's the easiest way. Whether that is really 18th century document that we sometimes venerate more than we should, that's a different kind of question. Okay, any other question? Or I'm glad the students spoke. Your last chance for other questions? All right, thank you for coming. Thank you, Ken, for a very stimulating talk. Thanks, Dave and Lee. And thanks, Sammy, also for helping. Have a good afternoon and nice weekend.